This section of the Bhagavatam that we're reading together is it's a collection of prayers, actually. These are prayers by Maharaj Satyavrata to a very special form of the Lord, Matsya Avatar. And with glorification prayers like these, there's different ways of glorifying someone. Just like in our own relationships, we have different ways of glorifying someone. One way of glorifying them is to go into immense detail in terms of their different qualities that we appreciate about them, for instance. Another way of glorifying might be to remember certain things about them, to recall things that they've done in our life, for instance, that we really appreciate, or that really illustrates their wonderful qualities. Another way of glorifying, and we see that in this series of verses, is glorification through comparison. And if we're not fully aware that that's what's going on, it can seem a little bit jarring to our ears. It can seem a little bit, it might seem a little too strong. And we've seen this in the last series of verses. For those who have been following along, there's some very, very strong statements, both in the verses themselves and then in Srila Prabhupada's purports to the verses, that seemingly make very strong, even condemning statements towards other beings, personalities, whether divine personalities like the Devatas, or as we see in this verse today, gurus. And while this may strike us again as a little bit, odd, that why is the Bhagavatam so heavy on kind of seemingly condemning these folks? If we understand it in the context of glorification, it helps. Because the emphasis of the Bhagavatam, right, and in one sense, the point of Bhakti, if we're practicing Bhakti, our focus is on glorifying the Supreme Lord. Our focus is on appreciating the wonderful, extraordinary qualities of the Lord, and by extension of Krishna's devotees. To do that, sometimes this point of comparison is one way of doing that. So I was reminded, just as an example, a number of years ago, when my daughter was quite young, in her school, in her elementary school, they one year on Valentine's Day, they had this project that the teacher worked with them on called Letters of Love. And of course, they're small children, so they were instructed to write these letters expressing their love towards their parents. And they invited the parents in, and all the children read their letters out and made these little presentations. It was so sweet. And I remember Shruti, actually, our daughter, she wrote a letter to me, so I attended, and she gave this presentation. And her presentation, she began by saying, "Dear Papa, you are the best Papa in the whole universe. If someone were to look up on Wikipedia and they were to look up amazing Papas in the whole world, you would be on the top of the list," right? And all these little sweet ways of saying, that other Papas do this, but you do even more than them, right? Other Papas help their kids with their homework, but you just, you would stay up all night and all day to help me with my homework, right? So it's almost like these very grand kind of statements, and to emphasize the point, comparing me to the other parents. Now, of course, this was an expression of love. I didn't take it literally that, oh my gosh, I'm, let me go look up on Wikipedia if I'm the top-rated father in the universe. But it's an expression of love. What was also interesting is all the kids did this, right? So one after the other, you hear all these kids saying, "My dad is the best dad, my mom," right? But it's an expression of love. So the reason I'm bringing this up, it's not that I'm not saying we should disregard what the Bhagavatam is saying, but we need to understand it in the spirit of Bhakti, in the spirit of the Bhagavatam, which is first and foremost an expression of love. So when Satyavrata is expressing these prayers of glorification to his beloved Lord, His point is not to condemn others. His point is how extraordinary, how amazing is the Lord. If we could, I think I'm going to share the screen again. See if hopefully this works. Can you all see the screen?
Yes, Prabhu.
Okay, wonderful. Let's just take a few minutes to look at the words of what's being spoken, because there's really kind of two comparisons here that I want to touch on this morning. And sometimes it helps to kind of go through the verse in a little bit more detail. This is one of the verses where Srila Prabhupada's translation really kind of colors and embellishes the verse itself, right? So sometimes we see this where Srila Prabhupada will add a little bit of color and commentary even into his translation, right? Kind of reading between the lines a little bit. But if we just look at the word for word and we just kind of try to understand what's going on here, it's really interesting. So it begins with this idea of jano janasya dishate. Jana means person, kind of, and it's like a generic term for people or persons. So what is this saying? A person, jana, an ordinary person, uh, accepts another ordinary person or takes instruction from another ordinary person. So jana to jana. So one ordinary person is instructing another ordinary person. And what are they instructing them on? The nature of the instruction is asatim gatim. So asatim gatim means a material goal, where the goal is material. The goal is asat. It's not permanent. It's impermanent. It's not ultimate truth. It's relative. It's not spiritual. It's material. So this is what's being described, that in the ordinary course of affairs, an ordinary person accepts another ordinary person as a teacher. But that instruction is, the goal of that instruction is ultimately material. And what happens? Yaya prapadyate duratyayam tamaha. That yaya, as a result of that, prapadyate duratyayam tamaha, that person experiences or achieves or surrenders to duratyayam tamaha, this seemingly insurmountable, dense darkness of ignorance. So it's again a strong statement, right? But why is this being said? So the second half of the verse sheds light on what is the point of making that heavy statement. Tvam tu avyayam. Tu means but, or however, right? So however, right? So now the verse is turning. However, you, tvam, avyayam, jnanam, amogham, anjasaha. You give this jnanam, this knowledge that is amogham, that is completely spiritual, that's without any material contamination, that's pure. Avyayam, right? In contrast to the duratyayam, avyayam, it's eternal, it's indestructible. And yena, prapadyate yena jano nijam padam. By this knowledge, prapadyate, jano prapadyate, that person achieves nijam padam. Now it's really interesting. What do they achieve? They achieve their original position. They achieve what is their birthright anyway. They achieve actually their true goal, their true home. So there's two contrasts going on here. I'll stop the share. There's two contrasts going on here. The first is that the Lord is being contrasted to ordinary teachers in the course of life, ordinary guides, gurus. In Srila Prabhupada's purport, he kind of focuses on the idea of guru, and he gives some very kind of colorful examples. I think there's something a little almost like humorous about it, where he talks about, you know, one guru says, oh, you should maximize your sex life. And one guru says, you should put all of your intelligence into building up a very strong body, and so on and so forth. These are examples. But the idea is, in the ordinary course of life, we accept so many teachers. So let's reflect on this a little bit. the fact is, if we really think about it, we're accepting teachers all the time. It's probably one of the most natural kind of instincts that we have. It's part of what it means to be human. In the Gita, Krishna instructs Arjuna that to learn the truth, tadvidi pranipatena pariprashnena sevaya, that there's a process. And of course, Krishna is speaking in terms of the truth in the ultimate sense, but we can think about it even in terms of anything we want to learn, any truth, even a relative truth, any skill set, um, any way we want to improve our lives. There's a process, right? Pranipatena, tadvidi pranipatena pariprashnena sevaya. So uh, uh, tadvidi pranipatena. Pranipatena is we approach with some humility, right? A teacher. So you want to learn something, you go, you kind of submit to a teacher in some way. You register for a course, you hire a life coach, right? Now, we may not be expressing the ultimate mood of humility, but we humble ourselves in some way. We recognize, look, this person has something that I don't have, and I want that knowledge. I want to improve, right, in some way. Pariprashnena, we actively ask questions, right? We show our enthusiasm. Those of us who are students, perhaps, it, or maybe for those of us who are teachers, either in an academic setting or another setting, we know the most dynamic educational experience is when there is a healthy amount of questioning and responses, right? It's very boring in a class if no one asks a question. No pressure to ask questions in this class, but it's boring in a class generally for an instructor if you can't tell if the students are awake or asleep because no one's asking any questions or pushing back or sharing comments or anything, right? So that's a part of the process. And then sevaya, on some level, even if it's a very subtle thing, even if it's not like service in the direct sense, there's some sense of, let me do something, even if it's just, writing a check for tuition. There's some act of, I'm going to do something for the teacher, right? And in a traditional mode of education, like in the Gurukula system or in the East, in the tradition of like the martial arts, for instance, there was this notion of you would actually perform some menial service, not because the menial service itself is so important, but because it's an expression of your seriousness as a student. So this process is there, and it's there in not just the spiritual sphere, but in practically learning anything, improving our lives in any way. When Srila Prabhupada wrote this purport, what to speak of when the Bhagavatam was composed, we were quite, I don't think anyone could have really predicted, maybe Vyasadeva could have predicted it, I don't know, but who could have predicted the explosion in the sort of self-help improvement industry? We have life coaches, we have motivational speakers, we have this emphasis on wellness and improving one's life, perhaps like never before. And is it good or bad? Well, it could be good or it could be bad, right? It really depends on, in so many ways, the approach of the teacher, the approach of the student. As Srila Prabhupada points out in the purport, if a teacher is sort of emphasizing the more rajasic or tamasic, aspects of life, or they're approaching in a rajasic and tamasic way, that's what the student is going to get. That's not to say that teachers and life coaches can't approach things in a more sattvic way. And we see there's so many examples of this. In fact, there are quite a few devotees who are entering into this sphere as well. And it's not a bad thing. It's actually serving a really wonderful need. People are hungry for how to clarify and improve their lives, how to add this clarity, knowledge, goodness, purity into their lives. And so a teacher approaching it from a more sattvic perspective and helping others to introduce more sattva into their lives, it could be a really wonderful thing. It could be really helpful on a emotional level, on a physical level, and even help to prepare one for a more kind of direct spiritual experience. So the point again is not to put down, material teachers. We need them. We need them for, right? If I want to learn computer programming, you know, maybe there'll be some mystical transmission if I read enough Bhagavatam and Chaitanya Charitamrita and Bhagavad Gita. But chances are that's not going to happen. And instead, I'm going to need to go to a computer programmer and learn the nuts and bolts of computer programming. So there's nothing wrong in that. Where it starts to become a problem and why the comparison is such an appropriate one, I think, what the Bhagavatam is really pointing out here is if we're not careful, we mistake an ordinary experience of a teacher teaching a student, right? This jana, ordinary transmission of knowledge. If we're not careful, we mistake that to be the all in all. We think if I just do enough of that, my life will be fulfilled, right? If I just get enough, maybe this life coach is not cutting it, I'll get another life coach. I'll get my life coach's life coach. If maybe my problem is I need a CrossFit trainer, so I get a trainer and I really work and really kind of develop my physical strength and fitness and endurance. And maybe, okay, that's not, let me see if let me get into Enneagram. Okay, Enneagram is doing something, but it's not doing everything. Let me get into this, let me get into that. We can jump from thing to thing to thing to thing to thing. Just like yesterday we heard a little bit from Kripamoya Prabhu about the kind of the dangers of kind of approaching a guru or demigods in this sort of idea of what can I get from this person, what can I get from that person. So we can get into that mindset and we can think if I just amass enough sort of this, little bits and pieces of ordinary learning from here and there, ultimately it will give me that fulfillment that my heart is craving. And what does the Bhagavatam tell us right from that first canto, right from the very first core teachings of the Bhagavatam, that what's going to truly satisfy not just the heart in the sort of more superficial sense, but the deepest core of us, at the needs, the hunger of the soul, of the real self, yatma suprasiddhati, what is going to actually fill that hole, what is going to actually fulfill us and satisfy us and give us that contentment that we're craving. It's bhakti. It's bhakti to adhoksaja, to Krishna, who is unlimited. Bhakti that is ahaituki, that is unmotivated and causeless, and that is apratihata, that is unending, uninterrupted, unceasing. Right? This is really what our hearts, what our souls are craving. And the danger is if we get so caught up in just thinking about, well, it's just about finding this guru, finding that teacher, finding that coach, that instructor, we miss this point that it's only really our divine source. It's only really Krishna, who knows us better than we know ourselves, and who's, like the Upanishads remind us, who's like that second bird in the tree, patiently waiting for us to turn back to him. He's really the only one that can give us that knowledge that doesn't just end in this life. Even the best life coach, and again, I'm not, this is not a knock on life coaching, but even the best life coach has to acknowledge that all of their coaching is a matter of this life, right? All we can do as embodied beings for one another is we can help one another within this one embodied lifetime that we're experiencing together. But Krishna is that beloved, that teacher of all teachers. Patanjali, the sage Patanjali, in his Yoga Sutras, he describes Ishvara as the most special, the teacher of all teachers. So in a similar spirit here, the Bhagavatam is celebrating that Sri Krishna is the teacher of all teachers, the teacher whose knowledge, whose guidance can lead us not just to the perfection of this one life, but to the perfection, to our ultimate perfection, to the perfection that takes us back home to our original position, our true home. And this is a second point of comparison, and I'll just touch on this a little bit, and then hopefully there's some questions or we can kind of share some reflections. The second point of comparison is the comparison between our temporary home and our true home. Nijam Padam, our true home, our original position. It's a glorification. This verse is a glorification of Krishna, because Krishna is that that beloved who is our true home, our true shelter, and who's waiting for us to return, who's eagerly anticipating. When you have a loved one who's away from home for a long time, when it's the day for you to return, where are they? How are they? What's their mood? Where are they waiting for you? Are they just like kind of doing their own thing? When they love you, they're waiting at the door. They're peeking through the window. Oh, is she here? Is Radhika here yet? Is Radhika here yet? Radhika's train got in. Is she here yet? Is she here yet? And then as soon as Radhika is walking towards the door, right, they can't wait anymore. They fling open the door. It's like they want you home even more than you want to be home. And I think of this wonderful imagery that we see this in the Brihad Bhagavatamrita, and there's a beautiful painting that depicts this scene of Gopakumar coming back home. Some of you may be familiar with this painting. There's a couple of different renditions of it. And Gopakumar, who's like representative of all of us returning home to Nijapadam, our original home, our true home. Gopakumar comes into the spiritual world, and there's the Gopas and the Gopis, and everyone is so happy to see him. And there's Krishna, and Krishna embraces him and takes him to his chest, and they're just embracing, and they're so close, and they're shedding tears, and Krishna is just holding him in that embrace. And it's like, welcome home, welcome home. I've been waiting for you. What took you so long? That's what the Bhagavatam is presenting us with. And to help us to understand that, the Bhagavatam and these other Shastra, these sacred texts, what they can sometimes do is what they often do is to encourage us, to enthuse us, to invigorate us and wake us up to remind us of our true home. What they can do is they can remind us of the temporary nature of our temporary home. And sometimes they do it in very strong terms. I was speaking with a friend and a student who had really good questions about, is the material world just like a really terrible place? She was asking, well, the way she phrased the question, she said, she was asking about something else in a slightly different context, but she began her question by saying, so the material world sucks, right? It's a very like kind of putting it bluntly. So the material world sucks, right? And da, 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 da. And we had to pause, and we had this conversation about, well, let's unpack that statement. Does the material world really suck? Is the material world really terrible? From one perspective, I think it's pretty undeniable that the answer is yes, right? In the Gita, Krishna says as much. He doesn't say the material world sucks, because Sanskrit is a little bit more poetic than that. But he says, what are the two words he uses to describe this material world, this samsaric world of birth and death and rebirth and redeath? He says, dukhalayam ashashvatam. Dukhalayam, so what a strong word. Dukhalayam is like a storehouse. It's like where all of like the dukkha, the suffering and misery is stored. It's like a place. It's like like when you go to the grocery store to get groceries, you go to like the clothing store to get clothing, you go to a toy store to get toys, you go to dukhalayam to get dukkha. Like that's all it is. It's like dukkha are us, for those who remember the Toys R Us. Anyway, I don't even think that store exists. But the point is, the material world is like dukkha are us. It's like, why do we expect anything else? According to the Gita, it is just this like embodiment of dukkha. And not only that, because we can push back from that and we can say, no, well, I experienced some happiness. But ashashvatam, he says, not only that, but it's a place of impermanence. By definition, it is a place of impermanence. Right? It's like the timer is set. As soon as we take our first birth, or rather our first breath, the timer is set. And whether it's things being taken away from us at the time of death, or even in smaller ways, things are impermanent, things don't last. So the kalayam ashashvatam, that's how the material world is described. Bhaktivinoda Thakur, in one of his bhajans, um, I don't remember if the bhajan has a different title, but it's commonly called Jeev Jago, Gora Chandra Bole, right? But he actually compares the material world, or he compares Maya actually to a witch. He says we're sleeping in the lap of a witch. So Maya is called a witch. Sometimes we imagine Maya to be this, like, like almost like a monster. In the Christian world, sometimes there's this saying, this kind of playful saying, not today, Satan. Have you ever heard this? This is like a kind of like, I guess my understanding is, I could be wrong, my understanding is like Christian folks are like, okay, well, every day I'm tempted by Satan to do something. And it's like, not today, Satan. You're not going to like trip me up today. Sometimes you see people with t-shirts that say, not today, Satan. And I know a devotee who's going to make a t-shirt that said, not today, Maya. Right? Because we have that conception sometimes that Maya is just like waiting to trip us up. She's like, often she, which that's a whole other concept because it's gendered. So Maya is envisioned as this woman, this sort of mysterious woman, or like a witch or something that's trying to trip us up. So anyway, that's one part of the equation, that if we look at it from that way, or like in the Chaitanya Charitamrita, Maya is described as slapping us, which I always thought was an interesting description, right? Slapping us. And Prabhupada says we're constantly being slapped and kicked by Maya. And yet we think it's enjoyment. So there are all these statements that Maya is so heavy and she's slapping us and kicking us, and she's like a witch and like a monster and like this satanic force that's just ready to like destroy us if we're not careful. But that's one part of the equation. But if we look at the other part of the equation, what else do we know about the material world? What else do we know about Maya? Daivi hi esha gunamayi, Krishna says. Daivi, she's divine. And Mai, she's mine. Krishna says Maya, this Maya is my energy, right? Another meaning of the word Maya is actually energy. Sometimes we say illusion, but also energy. So energy and the energetic are one. The energy, how can we hate or think negatively towards anything that comes from our beloved Krishna? So Maya is Krishna's energy. This material world is Krishna's creation, Krishna's, we can even say a manifestation, a very special manifestation, but a manifestation, right? Of Krishna's energy. Everything, all material and spiritual worlds are emanating from Krishna, he tells us in the Gita. So if that's true, then how can we actually say that Maya is evil? Or how can we have any kind of hateful attitude towards Maya? We can't. We shouldn't, actually. That's not our philosophy. That's not our theology. So why the contradiction or the paradox? The problem, again, the problem is not Maya. The problem is not the material world per se. The problem, if we dig a little bit deeper, is our conception, our misidentification, right? In other traditions, and we don't have time to get into it, but in other traditions, there's this emphasis on the world being illusion. There's one prominent acharya by the name of Shankara, Adi Shankaracharya, a great soul, who emphasized this, who taught, he said, Brahma Satya Jagat Mithya, that the Jagat, the world, the universe, the material world, is Mithya, is false, is an illusion. But our tradition, our Veda, our Bhakti tradition has a slightly different understanding. We don't say that the world is illusion because how can the world is Krishna's energy? Krishna's energy is not an illusion, but it is illusory in that if we misidentify it, then we take it for something it's not. If we're playing a board game, if we're playing Monopoly, and Rukmini wins a bunch of, I don't know if devotees play Monopoly, that's maybe a weird example, but if we're playing Monopoly and let's say Rukmini wins and she wins 10,000 Monopoly dollars and she wins the game, right? So the game was real. The pieces of paper, the monopoly money is real in her hands. The experience was real. But we're in knowledge if we understand that it was a game. And when the game is over, we put the monopoly money back in the box. But in this ridiculous example, imagine if Rukmini were to then take that monopoly money and were to go to, the shopping mall and were to try to purchase things with it. There would be something seriously wrong there, right? So what's the problem? The problem is not the monopoly money. The problem, we shouldn't go complain to the makers of this game. The problem is we're taking something out of its context, and we're trying to get something out of it which it was never intended to give us. We're trying to take a game and turn it into, in this example, our real life. We're trying to take a temporary home and turn it into a permanent home. And then we experience frustration and disappointment and even anger and envy and all of these sort of destructive, afflictive emotions, this whole chain which is described in the Gita that starts with sort of this misidentification and contemplation on the sense object as being kind of what's going to fulfill us and give us true happiness, and it ends in complete bewilderment and illusion. And there's all sorts of fun stuff like wrath and madness along the way, right? But this is the problem. The problem is not in the monopoly money. The problem is in my misidentification with the monopoly money. The problem is not in the temporary home. If we can learn to see this material world through the lens of bhakti in a way that is Krishna conscious, right? It's so interesting and kind of brilliant when you think about it. We take it for granted. We use that phrase Krishna consciousness like all the time, and we take it for granted. Think about how brilliant that term is. How much is just packed into that. If we can be conscious of Krishna at every moment, then while living in the material world, while functioning in the material world, we don't just see it as just an illusion, but nor do we see it as some, in some kind of mistaken way as the source of our happiness. So we avoid either extreme. We actually see it as this precious gift, or I would like to suggest to us that we can actually see it as this precious gift, this precious opportunity that's been given by Krishna for our edification, for our education, for our reform, for us to learn the lessons that we need to learn and then leave. I work in a college, and I'll close on this. I work in a college, as some of you know, and it's really interesting because I think a college or a university is a great analogy for the material world. Sometimes we use the analogy of a prison, which is a stronger variant of this, and which also works. But I like the analogy of a college campus, because what is a college campus? In one sense, if you think about it, a college campus is a very constructed environment. It's a kind of artificial environment if you really think about it. And for those who are familiar with it, it's actually quite sort of, it's been designed in a certain way to like replicate adult life and sort of the real world for students, but to also be this kind of like little insular bubble that's a little bit artificial also. And if you think about it, for students on campus, they have to kind of negotiate this understanding or this existence where they're in this bubble and they're engaging with it, but they also have to always keep in mind, to be healthy, that there's more outside of the bubble, that this bubble of, for most American students, it's 4 to 5 years as undergraduates, a little bit more if you add on like grad school. But this bubble is for a temporary duration of time. It's meant to teach me things. And ultimately, it's not my real home. If a student goes to the extreme of forgetting that and thinking the campus, the dorm is my real home, and 4 years are up, 5 years are up, and it's time for that student to graduate, and they just never graduate. They think, no, if I leave here, I'll cease to exist. Sometimes I've experienced this with students who are so wrapped up, we might say so attached, and I'm not saying this to blame them, but it can be such a painful experience of being so invested in their identity as college students that they just feel like, I can't exist outside of this campus. I can't leave. we recognize that would be something that would be very concerning. That would be a symptom of some deeper mental and emotional health issue, right? So we would want to help that student to realize, no, this is meant to learn and then to leave, to go on, right? But it would be similarly problematic if a student said, well, all this is meaningless because I'm just going to like leave here in 4 years. So let me just trash my dorm room and treat everyone like garbage. And right. No, that's not the point either. You don't disregard the temporary home. You recognize it for what it is, you honor it, you respect it, you take care of it, right? So Bhakti allows us in this analogy to be incredibly thoughtful, conscientious caretakers and temporary residents of our temporary home, but also equips us in the best way to journey back to our true home, to be ready, as Srila Prabhupada points out in this verse, to go to that place, that Vaikuntha Loka that is free of all anxieties, where the happiness and the fulfillment that my heart and my soul have been seeking are waiting for me. So I'll end there. And I'm sorry I took it right up to about 8 o'clock. So I think the deities will be giving their darshan. But if there's any, maybe brief questions or comments or reflections, we can take them now. And I think you can go ahead and unmute.
Wonderful point about the college campus analogy, about how there's some academic learning, some intellectual understanding, and then there's a point of application. And then we hear so many times that people say that Srila Prabhupada, one thing that people felt they're very intimidated by his movement that he set in motion was that people were absorbed in devotional service. When you hear ahaitukiya pratiyata, unceasing, unmotivated devotional service to Krishna is the only way to be satisfied. They were comfortable with going to church on Sunday for an hour or going to the Bhagavatam class in the morning. But when you talk about your whole day, your whole life, all your resources, all your time, all your strength, all your energy, all your talents being used in devotional service all day, every day, 7 days a week, 24/7, people were like, whoa, this is a cult, this is brainwashing. So it's true that we can get to the point of having some faith, but then will we actually do it and put both feet on the boat, not one foot on the dock and one foot on the boat, and give ourselves to Krishna? Really wonderful point. Fantastic.
Thank you so much, Prabhu. And I wish we had more time to talk about it more, but something I've been reflecting on lately is this idea, like you said so vividly, this 1 foot on the boat, 1 foot on the dock is not going to work. That's not how we can actually experience the fullness of Krishna consciousness. Something I've been reflecting on is how Krishna consciousness, bhakti, is meant to be integrated into every aspect of our lives, right? And that's not always so easy to do. We need to kind of figure out what that looks like for all of us.
We hear about it, then we desire it, and then say, Krishna, I'm yours. And Krishna, how wonderful is Krishna? He will help us get that other foot. Oh, there's Radha Muralidhar. Hare Krishna. Oh, glory to Prabhupada.
Thank you so much. So a wonderful note to end on, and I'll allow everyone to soak in, absorb, as Adi Pushpa said, absorb in the darshan of Radha Muralidhar, Gaura Chandra Mahaprabhu. So thank you all so much for this opportunity. Grantaraj Srimad Bhagavatam ki jai, Srila Prabhupada ki jai.